Food bank employee refuses to serve Democrat man in Harris WALZ hat. Unaware he's their top donor. The morning air in the small coffee shop was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed espresso and the soft hum of conversation. It was a regular weekday, and the steady stream of customers flowed in and out, their faces half-lit by the warm glow of the overhead lights. Most were quiet, focused on their work or lost in conversation, seeking refuge in the comforting ambience that the cafe offered. Behind the counter, Sarah, a young employee in her early 20s, was organizing the register and adjusting the display of pastries. She was a fixture of the coffee shop, always diligent, always attentive to the needs of the regulars who made up the backbone of the shop's business. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and the apron she wore was stained with a bit of flour from the morning rush. The bell above the door jingled as another customer entered the shop, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps on the wood-paneled floor. Sarah glanced up to greet the newcomer, but her expression shifted slightly when she saw him. A man in his mid-30s stood in the doorway, wearing a navy blue cap with the words Harris WALZ boldly embroidered across the front. At first, Sarah thought it was nothing more than a passing curiosity. She had seen political hats before many times actually, and had learned to brush off the occasional discomfort that came with such outward expressions of differing opinions. But something about this hat, the prominent, almost in-your-face design of it, made her feel uneasy. Maybe it was the reminder of the divisiveness it represented. Maybe it was just the audacity of wearing it in public like a challenge. Either way, Sarah didn't like it. She watched the man for a moment as he walked toward the counter. There was a strange tension building in her chest as he approached, and before she could stop herself, she felt her brow furrow. He set his order down, a simple coffee and a muffin, and smiled at her. "Hey there, how's it going?" he said, his voice friendly enough, but his eyes, those piercing, steady eyes, had an edge to them that didn't sit right with Sarah. "Good morning," Sarah replied with a strained smile, trying to mask the discomfort she felt. "What can I get for you today?" He placed his order, but as Sarah rang him up, she couldn't help but glance at the hat again. That word, Harris WALZ, struck her as so out of place in a place like this. It didn't belong here, not in the cozy, peaceful haven that the coffee shop was supposed to be. Her fingers tightened around the register, and she forced herself to push the thought away. "It's just a hat," she muttered quietly to herself. "It's just a hat." She tried to focus on the task at hand, but the man's presence felt like an unwelcome shadow that lingered over her. The hat was like a flashing sign, demanding attention, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man seemed to sense her discomfort, his eyes briefly flickering down at the register as Sarah handed him his change. He smiled again, but this time it was almost patronizing, as though he could read her thoughts. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, his tone light but probing. Sarah's smile tightened. She wanted to say that everything was fine, that she was just being paranoid, but something inside her simmered. "I'm fine," she said tersely, "thanks." He nodded and walked to the side, waiting for his coffee. Sarah turned away from him, feeling a rush of frustration and uncertainty. She had worked here long enough to know that there was something off about this situation, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Maybe it was just the politics of it all. People walking around, displaying their opinions for everyone to see. But the fact that he had chosen to wear that hat here in this environment made Sarah feel like he was trying to provoke a response. She tried to shake the thought from her head, focusing on the next customer in line. But as the minutes ticked by, her unease only deepened. Every now and then, she'd glance over at the man, who seemed oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in her chest. Just as Sarah was about to serve another customer, her eyes flicked back to the man, and she caught him smirking. He hadn't done anything outwardly wrong. No rude comments, no open confrontation. But that smirk, that sense of self-satisfaction, it made her feel like he was playing a game, one she didn't understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he picked up his coffee and turned toward the door. But before he reached it, he stopped, glancing back at Sarah over his shoulder. "You know," he said, his voice low but sharp, "I don't think you should be so quick to judge people based on their hats." Sarah blinked, taken aback by the comment. What was that supposed to mean? The man smiled again, his expression almost too calm. I'll be back. Maybe next time, you'll be a bit more open-minded. With that, he walked out of the coffee shop, the door jingling softly behind him. Sarah stood there, staring after him, her heart racing. What had just happened? Why had she felt so unsettled by the brief encounter? She stood frozen for a few more seconds before shaking herself out of her stupor. The tension in her chest remained, but she tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a hat, wasn't it? Just a symbol, a piece of fabric with words. Why should it bother her so much? But deep down, Sarah knew that something was not right. The words WALZ echoed in her mind, like an alarm she couldn't turn off. Why had she reacted this way? Why had her gut told her there was more to this than met the eye? Unaware of how much deeper this was going to go, Sarah turned back to her counter, trying to focus on the next order, but she knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the minutes ticked by, she busied herself with the usual tasks of the shop, but her mind kept drifting back to the man who had just left. The calmness in his demeanor, the way he seemed so confident, almost too confident for someone who'd just been asked to leave. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wiped down the counter, but she quickly steadied herself. Get a grip, Sarah, she muttered under her breath. It's just a hat. But that nagging voice wouldn't go away. The more she thought about it, the more the man's presence unsettled her. People like him had always bothered her, the ones who wore their political views so openly, as though their beliefs were the only ones that mattered. She hated the idea that someone could use something as simple as a hat to make a statement in a place meant to be neutral. A place meant for people in need, not for personal agendas. The bell above the door jingled again, and Sarah looked up, her eyes flicking toward the entrance. A regular customer walked in, and she greeted him with a polite smile, pushing the lingering discomfort to the back of her mind. But she couldn't help it. Her gaze kept drifting toward the door, wondering if the man in the hat would return. It wasn't long before Sarah's shift began to drag on. The hours seemed to stretch as she pushed herself to stay focused on the customers who came and went. But she couldn't shake the image of the man in the WALZ hat, that confident smirk, and his words echoing in her head. He'd be back. She knew it. Just after noon, a sharp knock on the counter startled her out of her thoughts. A middle-aged woman, new to the shop, was standing there with a raised eyebrow. Excuse me, dear, she said, her tone friendly but firm. Could you please help me with the coffee selection? I'm not sure what's best. Sarah nodded quickly, smiling despite the lingering tension in her chest. Sure, we've got a few blends. What kind of taste do you prefer? The woman went on to explain her preferences, and Sarah listened attentively, doing her best to push her growing irritation aside. But the more she tried to ignore it, the worse the feeling became. It was like an itch at the back of her mind that she couldn't scratch. Her eyes darted over to the front window, half expecting to see the man in the hat strolling by. Stop it, Sarah, she whispered under her breath, catching herself before she looked again. Focus on the customer. She tried, but the nagging thought wouldn't leave her. An hour passed, and just as Sarah was beginning to feel like the unease had started to subside, the door jingled again. Her stomach dropped. It was him, the man. This time, his posture was even more relaxed as he strolled into the shop. He was alone, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for a place to sit. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers frozen against the counter. She was determined not to make the first move this time, but she could feel the weight of the situation building. She didn't know if he was just trying to get under her skin, but she wasn't going to let him. He stepped up to the counter, and Sarah forced a smile, her voice tight. Back for another coffee? She asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. The man met her gaze, his eyes calculating, amused. I was thinking about it, he said coolly, but I'm wondering if the service has improved since last time. Sarah's smile faltered. He was taunting her. She could feel it in his words, the way he leaned slightly closer to the counter, almost as if he were daring her to say something. Her fingers tightened around the register, her mind racing. He was pushing her buttons, and it was working. "You didn't seem too happy with the service last time," she said, trying to keep her composure. "Is everything okay now?" The man grinned. "Oh, everything's fine. But I'll admit, the vibe in here isn't exactly welcoming, is it?" Sarah's jaw clenched. "You're free to leave if you're not happy with the service," she snapped, though she knew she had just taken the bait. "Is that what you really want?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You think you have the right to tell me to leave?" The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Sarah could feel her patience wearing thin. Why did he have to make everything so difficult? Why couldn't he just take his coffee and leave? She looked over at Greg, who was busy behind the counter, unaware of the escalation. She shot him a quick glance, hoping he'd step in, but he was too far away. The man didn't wait for her to respond. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping a few octaves. "You know, it's people like you who make places like this so uncomfortable for people like me. If you really knew who I was, you wouldn't be so quick to judge me. You'd be thanking me for making sure you have a job." Sarah's eyes widened, but she didn't react immediately. What did he mean by that? She had heard enough of his condescending remarks to last a lifetime. But this was different. "What are you talking about?" she asked, a mixture of confusion and frustration creeping into her voice. The man smirked, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "Just think about it for a second. Maybe you'll figure it out." The woman who had been standing in line behind him stepped forward, cutting through the tension. "Excuse me, could you hurry up? There are others waiting." The man ignored her, his eyes still locked on Sarah. She felt a wave of heat rise to her cheeks, a rush of embarrassment and anger flooding her at once. How had this escalated so quickly? He was just wearing a hat, wasn't he? Why was this turning into something so personal? "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "But if you're going to keep making this difficult, I'm going to ask you to leave again." The man shook his head slowly, his smirk growing wider. "You're really in for a surprise." Just then, the door opened, and a few more people walked in. The shift in the room was immediate, as if the arrival of new customers brought a fresh layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Sarah felt the pressure mounting, and for the first time in a while, she began to question herself. Was she in the right here? Was he really just trying to provoke her? Or was something more going on that she didn't understand? The man didn't seem to care one bit about the growing crowd. He just stood there, waiting, as though expecting Sarah to make the next move. And still, she hesitated. She couldn't place it. Something didn't add up, and as much as she hated it, she had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to end the way she expected. The man at the counter stood still, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet challenge. Sarah's mind raced. She had spent the last several minutes trying to maintain her composure, but the longer he lingered, the more it seemed like he was goading her into a confrontation. She couldn't decide if he was truly oblivious to the way he was making her feel or if he was enjoying the discomfort. "I told you, I'm just here for a coffee," the man said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You don't need to make this harder than it is." But Sarah wasn't sure what he meant by making this harder. Was he implying that it was her fault? Was it really her problem that he decided to wear that hat? The more she thought about it, the more irrational it seemed, and yet the frustration only grew. "Look," Sarah said, her voice tight, "I don't want to escalate this, but I've already asked you once. Please leave." The man's eyes narrowed as he leaned in, his voice softening as if he were speaking to a child. "You think I don't know who I am? Who I represent?" He paused for a moment, letting the silence hang between them. "Do you even realize who's standing in front of you?" A wave of unease washed over Sarah, but she refused to show it. The tone in his voice made her stomach flip. She tried to push it down, to focus on the fact that she had the right to ask him to leave. He was making everyone uncomfortable. She didn't have time for whatever game he was trying to play. "Don't play these games with me," she snapped. "You're just some guy who thinks he can get away with anything because of his political views. It's not right, and it's not fair to the people who come here looking for help." The man didn't react right away. He just stared at her, his eyes colder now, harder. There was a strange calmness in his expression, almost as if he were watching her unravel from the inside out. The atmosphere in the coffee shop seemed to shift as well. Customers began to glance over, the tension building in the air. It was like they were all waiting for something to happen, unsure of what that something might be. A woman standing near the counter muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Why doesn't he just leave? It's not like he needs coffee anyway. He's probably here just to cause trouble." The comment stung, and Sarah's eyes flicked toward the woman, feeling the weight of her words. But she didn't respond. It wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about maintaining control of the situation. She couldn't let herself back down now. "I've told you what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly, but still firm. "Either take the hat off or leave. This is a place of peace, and I don't need someone like you stirring things up." The man's lips curved into a smile again, but it wasn't a friendly one. There was something almost smug in it, something that Sarah couldn't place. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, casually leaning against the counter as if they were having a normal conversation. "I'll leave when I'm ready," he said, his voice almost too calm. "And I don't need your permission for that." Sarah's eyes widened at his words. The audacity! She couldn't believe it. She had never been challenged like this in the coffee shop. Sure, there had been the occasional misunderstanding, a moment of tension here and there, but nothing like this. She stepped back, her heart racing, feeling the heat in her cheeks as the crowd's attention grew more focused on her and the man. He was clearly enjoying the attention, drawing it out, knowing that his next move would only escalate things further. "Do you think I care about what you think?" he continued, his voice still dripping with that same condescension. "What are you going to do? Call the cops on me? I've seen it before. I'm sure they'd love to get involved in your little drama." His words were biting, each one cutting deeper than the last. Sarah felt herself becoming unraveled by his tone, the way he was pushing her buttons, daring her to do something. What was he trying to prove? Did he really think he could just walk in here, disrespect everyone, and walk away without consequence? You can't just come in here, treat people like garbage, and expect to get away with it, Sarah said, her voice trembling, but she stood her ground. "There's a line and you've crossed it. I'm asking you to leave now." For a moment, the man didn't respond. He just stared at her, his gaze unwavering. The other customers seemed to sense that something had shifted, but no one spoke up, unsure whether to intervene. The silence in the shop was deafening, broken only by the soft buzz of the espresso machine and the faint shuffle of feet. Then, to Sarah's surprise, the man took a step back from the counter, his face suddenly neutral. He raised his hand in a dismissive gesture. "All right," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "I'll leave, but remember this. People like you are the reason places like this are falling apart." He turned to leave, his words lingering in the air like a threat, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might just be walking out of her life for good. But as he reached the door, he stopped. Slowly, he turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "You'll regret how you treated me today," he said quietly, before walking out of the coffee shop without another word. The door jingled softly as it closed behind him, and the tension in the room seemed to evaporate almost instantly. Sarah let out a slow breath, her pulse still racing. The customers slowly returned to their own conversations, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed. She couldn't let it go. The man had just left, but she knew that this wasn't the end. The words he'd spoken hung in the air, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder who he really was. Why did he act the way he did? What had just happened? And who would be the next person to come in and challenge her resolve? The air in the coffee shop felt thicker now, more charged than ever. The door had barely closed behind the man when Sarah realized just how much her world had shifted in that brief, uncomfortable exchange. She stood motionless for a few seconds, her mind racing with the words he had said. "You'll regret how you treated me today," he had told her. The words echoed in her head, turning over and over like a broken record, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Her palms were clammy, and her heart was still pounding, as if she had narrowly avoided a confrontation far worse than what had already transpired. What did he mean? Why had he said that? Sarah shook her head, trying to push the thought aside. He was just another customer, right? But even as she tried to convince herself, there was a lingering doubt that she couldn't shake. She glanced around the shop, her eyes scanning the faces of the customers who had been silent witnesses to the entire interaction. Not one of them had stepped in to defend her. Not a single soul had said anything to back her up. The quiet buzz of murmuring voices filled the room as people returned to their own conversations, oblivious to the weight that now hung in the air. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, her every move scrutinized, as though the moment was being dissected over and over again in the minds of the patrons. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if everyone in the room could see her for the failure she was. The truth was, she had overreacted. Her judgment had been clouded by her own biases, and now it was too late to undo what she'd done. As she turned back to the counter, her gaze fixed on the window, Sarah could see the reflection of herself. Her expression was tense, her features sharp, and for the first time, she felt ashamed of the person staring back at her. Had she really done the right thing? Had she treated him fairly? She didn't know. Her certainty from earlier seemed hollow now, her mind riddled with doubts. But before Sarah could retreat into herself, the door opened again. A new customer entered, and once again, Sarah's stomach twisted. It was almost like déjà vu, like history was repeating itself, and Sarah found herself instinctively bracing for whatever was about to happen. This time, it wasn't the man from earlier. It wasn't even anyone who stood out in the crowd. It was a middle-aged woman who walked up to the counter with a smile, completely oblivious to the tension still lingering in the room. Sarah forced a smile in return, trying to push the thoughts of the earlier confrontation to the back of her mind. She had a job to do. She couldn't afford to let one customer's taunting words disrupt everything. "Hi, how can I help you today?" Sarah asked, her voice tight, but she did her best to sound professional. The woman smiled. "I'll take a large coffee, please, black." As Sarah moved to prepare the order, she couldn't help but glance over at the door. The man wasn't back, but the feeling of dread remained. Every time the door opened, she half expected to see him again. She half expected him to storm back in, demanding an apology, maybe making things even more difficult than they already were. She handed the woman her coffee, forced another smile, and turned back to the counter. Her gaze shifted toward the door again, and this time, her heart skipped a beat. There he was. The man in the WALZ hat had returned. But this time, there was no smug smile on his face. He was frowning, his brow furrowed with what looked like frustration. He approached the counter again, his steps deliberate. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she felt the sudden weight of the moment press down on her chest. She had to say something. She had to put him in his place before he did what he did last time, before he made everyone feel uncomfortable again. But before Sarah could speak, the man beat her to it. "You know," he began, his voice low but harsh, "I've been thinking about what you said, about how you treated me." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had hoped he would just walk in, get his coffee, and leave without another scene. But that wasn't going to happen. She could feel the tension starting to build again, like the first spark of a fire threatening to turn into an uncontrollable blaze. "I was just trying to enjoy my coffee," he continued, his eyes scanning the room. "But you decided to make a scene, just because I'm wearing a hat that doesn't align with your views." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It's not about the hat, is it? It's about control. You think you have the power to decide who gets to be here, who gets to shop here, who gets to exist here." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but her words caught in her throat. She couldn't deny it. Everything he said made her feel exposed, as if she had been caught in a lie she hadn't realized she was living. "You need to leave," she said finally, her voice coming out more strained than she intended. She couldn't help it. He was pushing her, testing her, and she was starting to feel like she had no way out. But the man didn't budge. Instead, he smiled, a small but knowing smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I'm not going anywhere." His words rang in the air like a challenge, daring Sarah to make the next move. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and for the first time, Sarah wondered if maybe she had miscalculated, if maybe she had made a huge mistake by confronting him so openly. The woman who had been standing behind him, seemingly uninterested in the confrontation, stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Why don't you just let it go?" she said, looking at Sarah. "He's just a customer." But the man shook his head. "No, I'm not just a customer," he said, his voice growing louder now. "I'm a person, and I deserve to be treated with respect." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but the woman's voice interrupted again, more forceful this time. "I think that's enough." The man stood tall, meeting Sarah's eyes, and for the first time, Sarah realized that she had no power here, not anymore. She could tell from his body language, the way he stood with such unwavering certainty, that he was the one who was controlling this situation. He wasn't going to leave. The tension in the coffee shop seemed to thicken with every passing moment. The man still stood at the counter, a quiet confidence in his posture as he faced Sarah. His eyes didn't leave her, almost daring her to make the next move, and Sarah felt herself shrinking under the weight of his gaze. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had dealt with rude customers, unruly behavior, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a disagreement, it felt like a battle for control. The woman standing nearby had returned to her seat, but her eyes were still fixed on the scene unfolding before her. She hadn't spoken up since her initial comment, but there was something in her expression that Sarah couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of curiosity and judgment, and it made Sarah feel more exposed than ever. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is a food establishment," Sarah said, her voice tight, almost a little desperate. "If you're going to act like this, then you can take your business elsewhere." The man simply raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in a half-smile. "You really think that's going to work?" he asked. His voice was smooth, too smooth, almost as though he were playing a game that Sarah didn't even understand. "You've already ruined the atmosphere here with your attitude," Sarah continued, trying to stand her ground. "If you can't respect the people around you, then you don't belong here." The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by an expression of mild amusement. "And yet here I am, still standing in your coffee shop," he said, his tone dripping with irony. "Is it me you're mad at? Or is it your inability to handle a situation like this?" Sarah's fingers gripped the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She couldn't understand it. Why was this man so calm? Why was he so unbothered by the situation when she was the one who felt like she was losing control? He was testing her, she could feel it. He was trying to provoke her, and it was working. "I'm not going to argue with you," she snapped, though her voice faltered at the end. She had hoped he would just leave, but now, standing in front of her, it felt like he was daring her to do something, anything, that would force him to leave. "I'm not asking for an argument," he replied, his voice still too calm for Sarah's liking. "I'm just trying to enjoy a coffee. But clearly, someone has decided that I'm not welcome here." The words hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She hadn't expected him to turn the tables so easily. It was as though he were using her own anger against her. He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to send a chill down Sarah's spine. "You know, you're not the first person to try and kick me out of a place simply because of my beliefs. But let me tell you something, you're not going to win this one. Not today." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in her head. She wasn't going to back down now. She couldn't. "Listen," she began, forcing her voice to sound steady. "I don't care what you believe in. This is a place for everyone. People come here to get away from the politics. I'm just asking you to take your political statements somewhere else." The man smiled again, a humorless, mocking grin that sent another wave of frustration washing over Sarah. "You really don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice low, the words laced with sarcasm. "This isn't about politics. It's about respect. About treating people like human beings, regardless of what they wear or what they believe in." His words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the sting of them, though she couldn't quite figure out why. It wasn't as though he was right. It wasn't about respect. It was about principle. It was about drawing a line, making sure people knew they couldn't come in here and flaunt their political beliefs like some badge of honor. "I'm treating you just like I treat everyone else," Sarah said, though even she could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. "This isn't about your beliefs. It's about disrupting the peace." The man tilted his head, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Disrupting the peace? You've been treating me like I'm some sort of criminal. I'm not the one who's disrupting anything. I'm standing here, minding my own business, and you're the one making a scene." Sarah's chest tightened. Was he right? Was she overreacting? Maybe, just maybe, she had taken things too far. But she couldn't let herself back down now. She had drawn the line, and she wasn't about to let him cross it. "I'm asking you nicely to leave," she said, her voice firm once more. "And if you don't, I'll have to ask for help." "Ask for help?" The man chuckled darkly. "You mean call security? Is that how you're going to handle it? You think that's going to make everything better? That's cute." Sarah's heart pounded. He wasn't going to leave. He wasn't going to make this easy for her. And yet, there was something about his demeanor, something in the way he carried himself, that made her feel like she was losing. The game wasn't over, but the longer it dragged on, the more it seemed like winning. As the man stood there, unflinching, Sarah could see that he wasn't going to budge. His calmness in the face of her frustration, his ability to turn every word she said back on her, it was infuriating. And yet, somehow it made her feel small. She looked around the shop, seeing the faces of the customers who had once been immersed in their own conversations. Now they were watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Sarah felt the pressure building. The room was too quiet, too still, and she realized everyone was waiting for her to act. And yet, nothing she did seemed to make a difference. She had lost the upper hand. She wasn't in control anymore. Her breath hitched when she saw the man lean back slightly, as if he were done with the conversation, as though the game had reached its climax. He stared at her with that infuriating, calm demeanor, waiting for her to react. "Why do you keep pushing this, Sarah?" he asked, his tone deceptively soft. There was something almost pitying in his voice now, as if he were speaking to a child. "Don't you get it?" Sarah's lips tightened. "I get it just fine," she retorted. "I told you to leave and you still refuse. You think you can come in here, make people uncomfortable, and it's okay? I don't care what your political views are, but this is a place of business, not a platform for your agenda." The man let out a quiet laugh, one that sounded more like a scoff. He didn't even flinch at her words. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You're missing the point, Sarah. This isn't about what I'm wearing or what I believe in. This is about you thinking you have the power to kick me out. You thinking you can decide who belongs here and who doesn't." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She was beginning to see it now. This wasn't just some angry customer. This was someone who was far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. "Listen to me carefully," the man continued, his voice steady, but carrying a certain weight. "I'm not just some guy who wandered in here, some random customer you get to toss out. I don't think you know who I am." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I don't care who you are. You've been nothing but disrespectful, and I'm done tolerating it. You have two choices. Take off the hat and leave, or I'll have security escort you out." The man's lips parted in a small smile, but it wasn't the smile of someone who was defeated. In fact, it looked almost amused. "Okay, Sarah," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You want to know who I am? Fine. Let me tell you." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with a cold intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I'm the one who makes sure this place runs. I'm the one who funds this shop, who keeps the lights on, and who ensures that you have a job." Sarah blinked. The words didn't immediately sink in. Her mind raced, trying to process what he had just said. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly now. "I'm the one who owns this coffee shop, Sarah. My mother and I started it a few years ago, and I've been the silent benefactor ever since. But if you really want to know who I am, I'm also the reason you're standing here today. The reason this place hasn't shut its doors." For a moment, Sarah could only stare at him, the weight of his words landing like a punch to the gut. You own this place? Sarah whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Yes, I do, he replied, his tone now completely free of the smugness that had marked their earlier exchange. He didn't need to boast anymore. The power in his words was clear enough. And the hat is just my personal choice. It doesn't change the fact that I'm the one who writes the checks. I'm the one who made this business what it is. And you, Sarah, treated me like dirt because of a simple political statement. Sarah stood frozen, unable to find the words to apologize or even explain herself. The embarrassment was overwhelming. The man studied her for a moment, his expression now softening slightly, though his eyes still carried the weight of the revelation. Now do you understand why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover? He asked, his voice quieter, but still carrying that sense of quiet authority. I never thought you'd act like this. I thought you were just some random guy with an agenda, making a scene. But you, Sarah started, but she didn't know how to finish the sentence. I was wrong. I'm sorry. The man sighed, clearly unimpressed by her apology. Sorry isn't going to change what happened. You've made it clear how you feel about people who don't think like you. He took a long pause before continuing. And that, Sarah, is the real problem here. You've got to learn how to treat people not based on what they wear or what they believe, but just because they're people. For the first time, Sarah felt the full weight of her mistake, the way it had rippled through every decision she had made that morning. She had overreacted. She had let her own bias and frustration dictate her actions, and now she was paying the price for it. I'm not here to make a scene, he said, his voice firm but calm. I'm here to say something important. For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to expect. Was this his way of getting the last word? Or was it a confrontation about the earlier incident? But as he spoke, there was something in his tone, a quiet sincerity, that stopped her from shutting him out completely. You know, he said, I was angry at first, not because of the hat, but because of how quickly you judged me. People do it all the time, but it's always disappointing when it happens in a place that's supposed to be welcoming. This place should be about more than just serving coffee. It should be about setting an example for the community. His words hit Sarah harder than she expected. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She felt the full weight of his message, and for the first time since the confrontation, she felt her walls come down. I was wrong, Sarah said quietly. I shouldn't have judged you like that. The man nodded, a small flicker of approval in his eyes. We all make mistakes. The key is to own them and learn from them. It's what makes us better. Sarah stood there, still processing his words. The realization had finally hit her. This wasn't just about what had happened today. This was a wake-up call. She had let her assumptions dictate her actions, and in doing so, she had damaged the very thing that made her good at her job. Respect. The man turned to leave, and Sarah watched him go. This time, however, there was no bitterness in her heart, only a profound sense of understanding. Sometimes it's not just the customer who has to change. Sometimes we have to change too. But the sinking feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. There was no ignoring the fact that she had just disrespected the man who could destroy everything she had worked for. And there was no escaping the consequences of that now. Just as Sarah turned to head to the back office, the door opened again. Her heart skipped a beat. For a split second, she thought the man was back. But instead, it was Greg, one of her colleagues, coming out from the back with a coffee pot in hand. Hey, Sarah, everything all right? Greg asked, a concerned look crossing his face as he saw the distant, almost panicked look on her face. She sighed heavily, rubbing her forehead. No, everything's not all right. What happened? Greg asked, taking a step closer. Sarah shook her head, her mind still spinning. That man, the one I had the confrontation with, turns out he's the owner of the shop. He's the one who funds it. I just treated him like a regular customer, and I kicked him out. I told him to leave over a hat. I didn't even recognize him. I probably ruined everything. Greg's eyes widened, his mouth falling open in disbelief. Wait, he's the owner? The owner? How did you not know that? You really didn't recognize him? Greg continued, his voice tinged with frustration. "This isn't some random guy you can just push around. You made a huge mistake, Sarah. You never know who you're dealing with, especially in a place like this." He paused, his gaze intense. "You've been working here long enough to know that. That was a colossal misstep." Sarah felt a flush of shame rise to her cheeks, the weight of Greg's words sinking in. She had hoped he'd offer some sympathy, some kind of reassurance. Instead, all she got was judgment. And the worst part? She knew he was right. She had acted impulsively, letting her emotions cloud her judgment. And now she was paying the price. Greg didn't soften his stance. "You have to be careful who you challenge, Sarah. There's a line between standing your ground and being stubborn. Today, you crossed it. You've made this more difficult than it needed to be." "I didn't know." Sarah started to protest, but her voice trailed off. There was no excuse, no way to justify what she had done. Greg was right, and her stomach twisted with the realization that she had made a rookie mistake. Greg sighed, shaking his head. "Look, I get that people can be frustrating, but that's no excuse for acting like that. We don't get to pick and choose who we treat with respect based on their politics or appearance. And you should have known better." Sarah felt the sting of Greg's words, each one hitting harder than the last. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She knew he was right. She had acted out of frustration, without thinking, and now it was all coming back to bite her. She tried to hold on to her pride, but it was slipping through her fingers, leaving her vulnerable in front of Greg, the other staff members, and the lingering customers. Greg's voice was quieter now, but still firm. "You can't let things like this escalate," he said, his gaze softening just a little, but still filled with disappointment. "If you don't get a handle on this, it's going to ruin you here. You can't afford to be that impulsive when you're dealing with customers, especially when you don't know who they are." "I didn't mean to," Sarah started, her voice trembling. She felt small under Greg's scrutiny, but she had to say something. She had to defend herself somehow. "I was just trying to make sure no one felt uncomfortable. It wasn't about politics, it was about—" Greg cut her off, his tone more intense now. "It is about politics. It's about you deciding to draw a line in the sand based on your own beliefs and then trying to force others to follow it. You don't get to decide who belongs here and who doesn't. That's not your job. And you especially don't get to throw someone out because their views don't align with yours." Sarah felt the weight of his words, and it was like a slap to her face. Her earlier anger, her frustration, everything that had been building up inside her, now seemed so insignificant compared to the bigger picture Greg was pointing out. She had acted on impulse, allowing her personal beliefs to cloud her professional judgment. And now it was clear that it was going to cost her. I didn't think about it like that," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt embarrassed, humiliated even, by how quickly she had let herself get caught up in something so trivial. She should have known better. She should have seen this coming. Greg let out a sigh, his expression softening just a bit, though his disappointment was still evident. "No, you didn't. But now you know, and you've got to learn from this." He looked at her for a moment longer, his eyes full of both frustration and something resembling sympathy. "You're not just here to serve coffee. You're here to represent this shop, its values, and its customers. If you let personal biases get in the way, you're going to push away the very people who come in here to enjoy their day. And let me tell you, that man, you've just turned him into an enemy." Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized the gravity of her mistake. This wasn't just about a customer. This wasn't just about her personal annoyance at a hat or a political stance. She had made a decision, out of spite and impulsivity, that had cost her far more than she realized. "I know," Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with regret. "I shouldn't have done that. I messed up." Greg nodded, his tone softening just slightly. "You'll get another chance, but you need to make it right. Don't let this become a pattern, Sarah. You can't afford it." As Sarah stood there, feeling the weight of Greg's reprimand, she realized that the damage had already been done. The man had already walked out, his words still ringing in her ears. And now she had to live with the consequences. There was no undoing what had happened. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to make things right. She could apologize, explain, and hope that it wasn't too late to salvage something from this disaster. Greg looked at her one last time, then turned back toward the counter, clearly still disappointed but also trying to keep things professional. "Get it together, Sarah. You've got this. Just think before you act next time." Sarah nodded, though the weight of her failure was still heavy in her chest. The day had turned into something she never expected, and she knew that it was far from over. This story serves as a stark reminder that assumptions can cloud judgment in ways we don't even realize. We all have biases, whether we like to admit it or not, and sometimes they lead us to make hasty decisions that can have consequences. But it's how we respond to those mistakes that truly defines us. Have you ever been in a situation where you made a judgment too quickly? Or maybe you've been on the receiving end of someone else's bias. In a world full of differing opinions, it's crucial to pause before reacting, to consider the bigger picture, and to treat everyone with respect, no matter what they wear, believe, or how they express themselves. Remember, it's never too late to make things right. Whether you're the one who made the mistake or the one who was wronged, the first step toward change is acknowledging where things went wrong and taking responsibility for it. Now, let's talk about how we can all work toward creating environments of understanding, respect, and inclusion. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going.